Hello, I'm Miss Matt Mullen and welcome to Macmo Literacy. Today we're having a look at some words from some mark schemes that will help you to climb up to the top bands of them. So every word that we're looking at today is an adverb, and that means that it describes a verb. So previously we've been looking at the command words that AQA specifically expects you to use in certain exams, things like analyse and summarise. But today we're going to be looking at how they want you to do those verbs, how they want you to complete that. And the three words that we're taking a look at are thoughtfully, critically and judiciously. Now, thoughtfully isn't too bad. I'm guessing that most people can figure out that that means to do something with thought, but you may be less familiar with critically and with judiciously especially. So let's take a look at our first word. First of all, we're going to look at the adverb critically. Now, you may well be familiar with the words criticise, critical and so on. So your initial thought might be that you need to insult things while doing it, analyse insultingly, but it's not quite like that. To be able to look at something critically is to be able to kind of pick it apart and judge things in a discerning way. So you're taking on the role of somebody who can objectively look at different aspects of something. And when I say objectively, I mean you don't let emotions or bias get in the way. So you're not going to jump to any conclusions. So if you can look at something critically, you're taking a step back and looking at all aspects of it and coming to a decision based on being really considerate and thoughtful. Obviously, we're going to talk about the word thoughtfully in a moment. But it's not to be insulting, it is to be thorough and unbiased. Now you'll see that the dual code that I've picked for today, so somebody with little mechanics going on in their head, just showing that they're really thinking about things. They're not letting their heart lead them in one direction or another, they're thinking everything through. Now today we're going to look at the Freya model, which is a way of building vocabulary, and this is what we're going to be doing from now on with each piece of vocabulary. So you'll see that I've filled this in for critically. Now, first thing that we do with the Freya model is to add our definition. In this case, it is to consider different parts of the problem and see it from different viewpoints. Then we discuss the characteristics, so the specific things that are found in this word, in this piece of vocabulary that we are picking up. So if you do something critically, you can look at problems and issues objectively. See, I mentioned that before about not being biased, so you're not being confused by your emotions or any thoughts that you've previously had on the topic. We'll also look at synonyms and examples. So synonyms, which means words that mean very similar things, are discern and judge. An example of a time that you might think critically instead of jumping to a conclusion is when you think about why a friend is acting differently and figure out why, rather than being annoyed at their behaviour straight away. So you're not letting yourself feel insulted and be overcome by emotion. You're taking a moment to think through the situation critically. And obviously this is an important skill for school, for the workplace, for anywhere where you're facing a problem, to be able to take yourself out of that situation and consider all aspects of it. Now the antonyms, an antonym is a word that means the opposite or almost the opposite, are naively and acceptingly, because we're not just believing all the things that we see, we are really looking at all aspects of this problem. And non-examples, so that's things that are the opposite of an example of this, are jumping to conclusions or being unable to look at both sides of a situation. So if you were doing that, if you were jumping to conclusions, you would not be thinking critically. And that's something that a marker would be looking for. They'd be looking for examples of you backing yourself up and discussing different aspects. This links a lot to a lot of the things that we were talking about in previous weeks, such as evaluating and justifying. So that is critically. Now moving on to our next word, which is judiciously, and probably the one that you're least familiar with. But it actually just means showing good judgment. Now you'll probably be familiar with the word judgment. Judgment is being like a judge. So you are able to look at all sides of the argument thoroughly, or all sides of the situation thoroughly, and come to a sensible final decision. Now, you don't need to be in a court of law or deciding whether somebody is a murderer or not in order to be judicious and to make decisions judiciously. It's simply any situation where you are thinking something through and picking the right decision. And you'll see a lot of similarities here between critically and judiciously. Judiciously is more aimed towards the final decision, the final judgment, but there are a lot of similarities. Earlier, when discussing the word critically, I mentioned discerning or being able to discern, and that's another word that simply means making a good judgment. And there are many, many words like this, and they're throughout mark schemes and throughout life and throughout things that will be written on job descriptions, because it's such an important skill. Being able to break apart a problem, think about the different aspects from different viewpoints, not just based on any previous bias that you may have, and then being able to form a good judgment is a massive part of so many areas of life. So let's look at our Freya model for this one. So as we've already said, the definition is showing good judgment, and judgment is considering decisions and coming to a good conclusion. Now, the characteristics of making a decision judiciously or doing something judiciously is to really consider what to do and making a good decision at the end of that. Synonyms, so words that are really similar to judiciously, are wisely, astutely, and of course discerningly, which we mentioned with the last word. So these mostly mean bringing knowledge and taking time and making the right decision. An example of doing something judiciously, and I have gone for one from an exam this time rather than from real life, not that exams aren't real life, is picking really good quotes to discuss in an English exam. So when you're doing a petal paragraph, just picking a really good quote, one that you've got lots and lots to say about. Now, antonyms of just judiciously would be lazy, rushing, unprepared, unplanned, because you're not taking that time. And I suppose biased would also be one, because just like with critically, you've got to be a little bit objective and step back. Some non-examples of it, so some things that would show that you weren't doing something judiciously, again linking to this idea of the English exam, would be deciding to write about the first simile you see and then having nothing to say about it. And a lot of pupils do this because they get really caught up on the subject terminology and finding something that they know the name for, like metaphor or simile. But if you're doing that, you're not necessarily picking your quote judiciously, because you should be picking something that you have an awful lot to say. And sometimes that will be a simile, but sometimes it will be something a little simpler, or sometimes it will be something a little bit more unusual. But it's far more important that you pick a quote judiciously than you know the name for the technique. As long as you can describe the effect of it, that's absolutely fine. And now that brings us to our final word, which is thoughtfully, and you'll probably think that this is the easiest one. So thoughtfully is to do something in a way that shows that you've considered the needs of the person or the thing or the problem or the task, right? You're taking time to think about what needs to be done and think about what is really required. Now, this may be a word that you're very familiar with, but how often can you say that you really do that in an exam? Do you stop and take the time to do things thoughtfully and put thought in, or do you just rush and write down the first things that pop into your head? Now, this is the importance of planning an answer. Obviously, this will change depending on what exam you're in, what subject you're in, what question it is, but for a longer question, it's very important that you show that you have planned, that you've considered the needs of the questions, and that you've put a lot of thought and detail into the answer. That's how you're going to achieve a mark for thoughtfulness, and that's one of the higher bands. Now, this time I would like you to do the Freya model on your own. So if you can write a definition for the word thoughtful, if you can put in some examples of being thoughtful and some non-examples, which would be examples of not being thoughtful. This can be in relation to an exam or just in general life in the word thoughtful. And of course, some characteristics of thoughtful behaviour, so the type of thing that you would do if you were thoughtful. So if you could pause and fill them in, please. And that brings us to the spelling section. First of all, could you spell the word critically? Paying attention to how many L's, what comes after the critic, etc. Spell critically. And if you could spell judiciously. And finally, thoughtfully. Amazing, and here they are on the screen, so if you just give yourself a moment to check over them before we go again. And off we go. So, critically, judiciously, thoughtfully. Great, and if you check them over before we go one last time. And finally, critically. Judiciously and thoughtfully. And there are the words finally, and hopefully you have a grasp on how to spell them now. And moving into our final section, which is our definitions and dual codes. And this week I have given you the dual codes. I have also given you one of the definitions there. If you can make sure that you have all 3 words written out with their definition and dual code, then I will see you next week. Have a lovely week.
Thank you for joining us for another week on Macamo Literacy. If you enjoy starting with a word and then ending up in a rambling journey to who knows where, then I suggest that you hit like and subscribe. Also, if you just want to be a pal, like and subscribe. See you next week.